The wind rolled low across the valley, tugging at the grass like restless fingers. The sky above the Montana hills was bruised purple, the last light of evening fading into a hard western dusk. In that dim horizon, a small figure stumbled through the dust, barefoot, bleeding, and draped in tatters of what had once been a white dress. Every step she took was a battle between pain and will. Her name was Eleanor Hayes, though anyone who saw her now might not have recognized her. Her face was streaked with dust and tears, her hair tangled with burrs and blood. The desert wind clawed at her like a living thing, and the fabric of her ruined gown fluttered behind her like the wings of some fallen angel. Her ribs ached where the bruises ran deep, and her palms were cut raw from where she had fallen again and again, trying to escape a man who had sworn to love her, and instead made her run for her life. She didn't know how many miles she had covered since leaving the estate behind. She only knew she couldn't stop. Not while he was still out there. Ambrose Ryder, the man the whole town called respectable, the man who smiled in church pews and donated to the schoolhouse, who shook hands with the sheriff and spoke about honor and family. No one saw what he did behind those locked doors. No one knew how his voice could turn from honey to venom in the same breath, how his hands could bruise without ever trembling. Eleanor had been his bride for less than a day. The wedding had been a spectacle. The Ryders were one of the oldest ranching families in the valley. Her own family had been struggling for years, her brother Michael barely able to keep their modest property afloat. When Ambrose proposed, everyone had called it a blessing. They said she'd be taken care of, that she was lucky to have caught the attention of such a man. She had smiled politely, nodded where she was expected to, and died a little inside each time someone congratulated her. Now, as the stars came alive over the plains, Eleanor ran, her lungs burned, and each gasp came out as a ragged cry. Somewhere in the darkness behind her, a horse neighed, distant but real, and her heart jumped into her throat. She couldn't tell if it was real or the echo of fear that lived in her bones. She pressed forward, her bare feet cutting on stones and dry brush, the coppery taste of blood in her mouth. When her strength finally gave out, she collapsed against the rough planks of an old fence, her entire body trembling from exhaustion. Ahead of her, through the shimmer of the night heat, she saw a faint outline. A house or maybe a barn. A single flicker of lamplight burned through one window. So small and steady it looked like hope itself. She whispered to herself, voice hoarse and barely there, just a little more. Eleanor crawled the last stretch. By the time she reached the edge of the yard, her vision had gone hazy. The dirt beneath her palms felt soft and strange, her body no longer her own. She pressed herself against the side of the barn, just trying to breathe. The scent of hay, horses, and oil filled her senses, grounding her, reminding her she was still alive for now. A sound startled her, the heavy creak of a door. She turned her head and saw him. A tall man stepped into the yard, lantern in hand. His movements were slow, deliberate. He was older, mid-50s, maybe more, with hair gone half silver and eyes pale as winter skies. He wore the dust of the land like a second skin, and his broad shoulders carried the kind of weight no one else could see. He stopped when he saw her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The night hung heavy between them, full of questions neither dared to ask. Then Eleanor's knees gave way. The lantern light caught her face as she fell, and the man was beside her before she hit the dirt. His hands were rough, calloused, but his grip was gentle. He caught her like he'd done it 1,000 times before, like he had once carried something precious and lost it. Easy now, he murmured, voice low and graveled. You're safe. You're all right, but she wasn't, not yet. Her lips parted, dry and cracked. Don't. Let him find me, she whispered. Then her eyes rolled back and darkness claimed her. When Eleanor woke, the world was different. Soft sunlight pooled through faded curtains, turning the room gold. The sheets beneath her were clean, though worn thin from years of washing. The smell of old wood and dried lavender filled the air. Somewhere a clock ticked softly, steady and calm. She blinked, trying to remember where she was. The last thing she remembered was the barn, the stranger's voice, and then nothing. Her body felt heavy, bandaged, and sore. Her lip was split and one eye still swollen, but her pain had dulled into something distant. The room around her was small, neat and unmistakably a child's. Toys lined the shelf. A wooden horse, a rag doll with yarn hair, a few faded ribbons hanging from a peg. The sight of them filled her with a strange ache, a mixture of comfort and grief she couldn't explain. The door opened with a creak. The same man entered, holding a tray with a steaming bowl of broth and a tin cup of tea. His eyes met hers, cautious but kind. "You're awake," he said. Eleanor tried to sit up, but her ribs protested. The man set the tray down and adjusted the pillow behind her. "Careful," he murmured. "You've been out for 2 days. Fever nearly took you." She studied him as he moved, steady hands, quiet eyes. He wasn't the kind of man who spoke more than he needed to. There was something about him, not coldness exactly, but distance. Like he'd built a wall between himself and the world and had long stopped expecting anyone to cross it. Where am I?" She managed. "Colton Ranch," he said simply. "Name's Wesley." "Wesley Colton." He gestured to the bowl. "Eat. You'll feel better." Eleanor hesitated, then reached for the spoon. The broth was simple, onions, potatoes, bits of beef, but it tasted like life itself. Her throat burned as she swallowed, her hands trembling slightly. When she'd finished, Wesley collected the bowl and stood by the window. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with things unsaid. Finally, he turned to her. "Who did this to you?" Eleanor froze. Her instinct was to lie, to say she'd fallen, that it was an accident, the same thing she used to say to her brother when he asked about the bruises. But there was something in Wesley's eyes that told her lies wouldn't hold here. He'd seen too much of the world to believe them. "My husband," she whispered. Wesley's jaw tightened. "Husband?" He said it like a curse. "Not anymore," she added quickly, her voice breaking. "Not after what he did." She looked down at her hands, ashamed though she had nothing to be ashamed of. "He'll come for me. He always does." Wesley was silent for a long time. Then he said quietly, "He won't find you here." Something in his tone made her believe him. He turned toward the door, as if to leave, but paused. "Rest now. You can tell me the rest when you're ready." The door shut softly behind him. Eleanor lay back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of safety. But under it all, her heart still thudded with fear, because she knew Ambrose Ryder wasn't the kind of man who let go. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The moonlight slipped through the window and pooled across the floorboards like spilled silver. She turned to the small table beside the bed where her belongings had been placed, or what little remained of them. The only thing of value she had managed to keep was her mother's music box. It was a small silver rectangle, tarnished with age. The lid was engraved with lilies, her mother's favorite flower. She lifted it carefully and the familiar melody filled the room, a lullaby her mother used to hum when she was a child. Beneath the velvet lining inside was a folded slip of paper. She'd read it 100 times before, a name and an address written in faded ink, Clara Ryder, Echo Springs, the same last name as her husband's family. The connection had never made sense to her. Her mother had died when Eleanor was young, leaving behind only this box and a handful of letters. But now, with everything that had happened, the mystery of that name felt heavier than ever. As the music played, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Why, Mama? Why did you keep their name?" The song ended, and silence settled again. In the next room, Wesley Colton sat by the dying fire, staring into the flames. The name she had murmured in her fever, Elizabeth, still echoed in his mind. His daughter's name, the one he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 7 years. When the fire cracked, he blinked, jaw tightening as memories returned. The house fire, the smoke, the way the world had gone silent after losing his wife and child. Since that night, he'd lived like a ghost on this ranch, speaking only when necessary, working until the ache in his bones drowned the ache in his heart. And now, this broken girl had appeared from nowhere, bleeding and afraid, collapsing on his land, and speaking the one name that had the power to rip his world open again. He reached for the half-empty bottle of whiskey by his chair, but stopped. His hand trembled slightly, then fell away. Instead, he stood and looked out the window toward the barn, the night stretching endless and black beyond it. There was something about the girl, about Eleanor Hayes, that he couldn't explain. Maybe it was her courage, the way she had survived something no one should have to endure. Or maybe it was something deeper, something that stirred a part of him he thought had long since died. Whatever it was, Wesley Colton knew one thing for certain. Her arrival wasn't an accident. And before this was over, the valley would remember what justice really meant. The sun climbed lazily over Echo Valley, spilling gold across the rolling plains and the distant mountains that guarded them like sleeping giants. Morning light filtered through thin curtains, painting soft stripes on Eleanor's quilt. For a moment, the peace of it all made her wonder if she had dreamed everything, the violence, the running, the fear. Then she shifted, and pain flared sharp through her ribs, grounding her in the truth. She was still on Colton Ranch, still alive, still not safe. The door creaked open just as she managed to pull herself upright. Wesley Colton stepped in carrying a kettle that steamed faintly in the cool morning air. He didn't say much, just set it down on the small wooden table, poured a mug of dark tea, and placed it within her reach. His silence was strange, but it wasn't cold. It was the silence of a man who'd said all he needed to the world and gotten nothing good in return. "You should stay off your feet a while longer," he said finally, his gravel-rough voice breaking the quiet. "I've rested enough," Eleanor murmured, though her body argued otherwise. His brow lifted slightly, a mix of amusement and reproach flickering across his weathered face. "Rest ain't weakness, girl. It's just the body gathering strength for the next fight." Something in the way he said fight made her glance up. His eyes, the color of distant storm clouds, didn't look at her so much as through her to memories she couldn't see. For a moment she almost asked what ghosts haunted him, but then she caught herself. She had enough of her own. When he left the room, Eleanor pushed the blanket aside and stood slowly. Her legs trembled, but she steadied herself against the dresser until the dizziness passed. Her mother's music box sat where she'd left it, silver tarnished to gray, the engraving of lilies catching the light. She traced a fingertip across it, and the metal was cool under her skin. The faintest thought flickered in her mind. "If I could just understand what you were trying to tell me, Mama, maybe all this pain would make sense." She slipped her feet into the boots Wesley had left her, too big by half a size but solid, and walked to the window. Outside, the ranch sprawled wide and silent, dotted with fenced pastures and weathered outbuildings. A horse stood tethered near the barn, its coat gleaming chestnut in the sun. Somewhere beyond the fence line, she saw the faint shadow of a man working, Wesley, his steady rhythm of motion somehow reassuring in its simplicity. For the first time in weeks, she felt something close to safety. By midday, Eleanor found him repairing a section of fence near the creek. The sound of hammering carried on the wind, deliberate, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. He noticed her before she spoke but didn't turn. "You're a stubborn one," he said, still hammering. "I didn't want to stay cooped up. You're barely stitched together. That fever almost took you." Eleanor crossed her arms. "I've had worse," that made him pause. He turned to face her, the sun glinting off the streaks of silver in his hair. "No one should ever get used to saying that," he said quietly. The words lingered in the air longer than either expected. She looked down, embarrassed by his kindness. It wasn't pity she felt from him. It was something quieter, heavier. Understanding. "Hand me that bucket of nails," he said after a while, the conversation shifting back to something practical. She obeyed, passing it over carefully. They worked in silence, side by side, two broken people pretending for a few minutes that building a fence could mend what life had splintered in them. After a while, Eleanor asked, "Why do you live out here all alone?" Wesley hesitated, then set down his hammer. "Because peace is hard to find in a town that keeps reminding you what you lost." He wiped the sweat from his brow, eyes narrowing toward the far hills. "Used to wear a badge once. Sheriff over in Benton County. Had a wife. Daughter too. Fire took 'em both." Eleanor's breath caught. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. He shrugged, but there was no dismissing the pain in the motion. Nothing left to do but keep breathing. "That's all grief really asks of you." The two stood there in silence, the wind carrying the low rustle of grass and the distant cry of a hawk. For Eleanor, it felt strange to be standing next to someone who spoke of pain without turning it into cruelty. Wesley had seen death, loss, violence, and yet he didn't use it to hurt others. He didn't raise his voice or his hand. It was as if he'd spent his whole life fighting to remember that gentleness was a strength, not a weakness. She thought of Ambrose then, how he'd once been charming, how his smile could melt a room before it froze it, how he'd told her on their wedding day that she was his prize, and that he'd never let anyone take her away. Her stomach turned just remembering it. Wesley must have noticed the shadow that passed over her face. He leaned on the fence post and said quietly, "You don't have to tell me what happened, but if you ever do, I'll listen." Something about those words, now so simple, so rare, nearly broke her. She swallowed hard and managed a nod. "Thank you." Days turned to a week. Eleanor began to heal, both in body and in spirit. She helped with the chores around the house, gathering eggs, washing dishes, mending torn shirts. Wesley let her, though he grumbled that she worked too much and ate too little. In the evenings, they sat on the porch together, watching the sun sink behind the ridgeline. The light would stretch long and golden over the valley, and the air smelled of sage and rain. Sometimes Wesley would tell stories about his years riding patrol along the border, about his late wife who could bake better than any soul in Montana, about his daughter Elizabeth whose laughter he still heard in dreams, and sometimes Eleanor would tell him about her mother, how she'd played that same lullaby every night before bed, how she used to hum it when storms came so her children wouldn't be afraid. But she never mentioned Ambrose Ryder, not yet. The word still lodged in her throat like a blade. One evening, as Wesley tuned the old radio in the corner, a static-filled voice came through, the station out of Echo Springs. The announcer was reading the latest notices, market prices, road closures, a charity fair. Then his tone shifted slightly. "And in local news," the voice said, "Ambrose Ryder of the Ryder estate is offering a $500 reward for information regarding his missing wife, Eleanor Hayes Ryder, believed to have fled under unstable mental conditions. Mr. Ryder requests any sightings be reported immediately to the sheriff's office." Eleanor froze. The mug slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. Wesley turned sharply, reading her face before she could say a word. Her eyes were wide with fear, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "He's looking for me," she whispered. "He's telling everyone I'm crazy and that I ran off." Wesley's expression hardened, the muscle in his jaw tightening. "That's how men like him keep control," he said grimly. "They turn truth into dust and call it gospel." Tears welled in her eyes. "He'll find me. He always finds me." Wesley stepped closer, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "Not here," he said, voice like iron. "No one finds what I don't want found." She met his eyes, and something in his calm steadied her trembling. But deep down she knew that Ambrose had power, money, influence, men willing to do his bidding. If he wanted her back, he'd stop at nothing. Wesley knew it too. The moment he saw that announcement, something old stirred in him, something he'd buried with his badge. A sense of justice, fierce and unrelenting. He'd seen too many women suffer in silence. Too many men get away because they had the right name and the right smile. Not this time. Not while he still drew breath. That night, after Eleanor had gone to bed, Wesley sat by the window cleaning his revolver. It had been years since he'd held it with purpose, but the weight of it in his hand felt familiar, like shaking hands with an old enemy. He thought of the girl asleep in his daughter's room, thought of the way she flinched when thunder rolled, the way her shoulders stiffened at every unexpected sound. He thought of how she'd smiled that afternoon when she helped a calf to its feet. A real smile, unguarded, like sunlight breaking through clouds. And he thought of Ambrose Ryder, the kind of man who broke things just to prove he could fix them. Wesley had seen his type before, respectable on the outside, rot in the middle. He holstered the revolver and stared out into the night. The valley lay quiet, bathed in moonlight, but somewhere beyond those mountains trouble was brewing. A few days later, as Eleanor hung laundry behind the house, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. A rider moving fast. Her stomach dropped. Wesley emerged from the barn, rifle slung over one shoulder, eyes narrowing. The rider slowed as he neared the gate, a young man in a deputy's badge. His horse snorted and pawed at the dirt. "Morning, Mr. Colton," he called. "Sheriff sent me out, looking for a missing woman." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small handbill. "Name's Eleanor Ryder." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Wesley stepped forward, expression unreadable. "Don't reckon I've seen her," he said calmly. "What's she done?" The deputy shrugged. "Nothing criminal. Word is she ran off from her husband. Poor man's worried sick." He glanced toward the house, curiosity flickering in his gaze. "Mind if I look around?" Wesley's voice dropped low, the kind of tone that could make a man think twice before drawing breath. "You're on private land, son. If the sheriff's got a warrant, he can bring it himself. Till then, I suggest you ride on." The deputy hesitated. Something in the older man's stance and the quiet authority, the unspoken history, made him uneasy. "All right," he said finally, tugging his reins. "If you do see her, let us know. $500 reward." Wesley didn't answer. He stood silent until the rider was a speck on the horizon again. Then he turned toward the house and found Eleanor standing frozen by the clothesline, a sheet twisting in her hands. "You heard?" he asked. She nodded, eyes glassy. "He's close." Wesley looked toward the mountains, then back at her. "Let him come," he said. "He'll find this valley's not as quiet as it looks." For a moment, the wind caught the laundry and lifted it high, the white fabric snapping like ghosts in the sun. And in that flash of brightness, Eleanor realized something she hadn't dared to before. For the first time since her wedding day, she wasn't alone. That night, thunder rolled in from the west, a storm building over the plains. Eleanor sat by the fire, staring at the flickering flames. Wesley moved quietly about the room, checking the windows, locking the doors. When he passed her chair, she spoke softly. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." He stopped, meeting her gaze. "Because once," he said, "I couldn't help the people I loved, and I've been trying to make peace with that ever since." Eleanor swallowed hard. "You think peace ever comes?" He looked toward the fire, its light carving deep lines across his face. "No," he said, "but sometimes justice does. And that's enough." The wind howled outside. Somewhere far off, lightning flashed, lighting the valley in white for just an instant, long enough for Eleanor to see the shape of her reflection in the window. And behind it, the faint, ghostly outline of Wesley Colton watching over her like a promise. The storm that had rolled over Echo Valley the night before left behind a world scrubbed clean. Puddles glimmered in wagon ruts and the air smelled of wet sage and iron. Dawn broke slow, as if the sun itself was wary of what the day might bring. From his porch, Wesley Colton watched mist lift off the fields and felt that familiar tension in his chest, the one that always came before trouble. Inside, Eleanor Hayes was folding the quilt that had kept her warm through the night. Each small act of normalcy felt like defiance. For a woman who had once lived under a man's thumb, even hanging laundry or sweeping a floor in peace was a kind of revolution. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the world beyond the ranch fence was closing in. The radio on the shelf crackled again at breakfast. Another announcement. Another reward notice. Ambrose Ryder's voice this time, smooth as glass, dripping with false concern. "If anyone sees my wife, Eleanor Ryder, please. She's ill, she's frightened. I only want to bring her home safe." Wesley turned the dial until static drowned the words. Eleanor stared into her coffee. "He always sounds so believable," she whispered. "That's what makes men like him dangerous," Wesley said. "The devil's got good manners when he needs 'em." She smiled faintly at that, but her hand still trembled. The first visit by noon, 2 riders approached the ranch. Dust plumed behind them like smoke. They weren't lawmen. Their vests were too fine, their smiles too thin. Wesley recognized hired muscle when he saw it. He met them halfway down the path, shotgun cradled casually in his arm. "Morning, gents," he greeted. The taller of the two tipped his hat. "You Wesley Colton?" "Depends who's asking." "Name's Garth. My employer, Mr. Ryder, figures his wife might have wandered this way." "You seen her?" Wesley studied the men a beat too long. "Can't say I have. Women don't tend to wander onto my land. Not alive anyhow." The shorter man chuckled nervously. "No harm meant, sir. She's just not right in the head." That word, not right, hit Wesley like grit in his teeth. He stepped closer. "Son, if she's out here running barefoot through coyote country, someone put that fear in her. You tell your boss that." The taller man's smile thinned. "You don't want trouble. Then you best ride on before you find it." They stared at one another for a heartbeat, then turned their horses and left. When their silhouettes vanished into the heat shimmer, Wesley exhaled and muttered, "Vultures." From the barn doorway, Eleanor had seen it all. The way he'd stood unmoving, unafraid. For the first time since her escape, she felt the faint pulse of safety deepen into something steadier. Trust. The letter. That night she could not sleep. The lullaby of the music box wound softly through the small bedroom, each note like a hand reaching across years. She opened the folded paper hidden beneath the velvet lining again. Clara Ryder, Echo Springs, her mother's handwriting, delicate, unmistakable. But Ryder, She carried the paper to the lamplight, heart racing. Could it be? Could her mother have been kin to Ambrose's line and kept it secret all her life? Was that why Ambrose had chosen her? Not out of love, but blood? The thought made her stomach turn. She needed answers, and there was only one man who might know how to find them. Wesley was in the main room mending a saddle strap. She hesitated in the doorway before speaking. "Wesley, you ever hear of a woman named Clara Ryder?" The tool froze in his hand. "Can't say I have. Why?" Eleanor set the paper on the table. "She was my mother." He leaned forward, reading the faded ink. "That's a name tied to old money. The Ryder family's been sitting on half this valley since before statehood." "I didn't know," she said. "Mama never spoke of them." Wesley rubbed his chin. "Maybe she didn't want their kind of power touching you. Sometimes family ain't worth the blood it costs." The idea lodged deep in Eleanor's chest. Maybe her mother had run from that world, and somehow fate had looped it back around, punishing the daughter for the sins of her kin. Wesley saw the pain flicker across her face and softened his tone. "You don't owe the name Ryder a thing. Out here, a person's worth comes from what they do, not what they were born to." It was the first time anyone had said that to her. The words felt like balm, whispers of the past. The next morning, Wesley hitched the wagon. "I'm heading into town," he told her. "Need supplies." "You stay here, keep the door bolted." Eleanor nodded, though dread coiled in her gut. She didn't like being left alone. He hesitated at the gate. "If anyone rides up, you know where I keep the rifle. Don't be afraid to use it." Hours later, thunderheads gathered again over the mountains. Eleanor spent the afternoon in the barn, mending a torn blanket and humming the tune from the music box to keep her nerves steady. The horses flicked their tails and shifted restlessly, as if sensing her unease. Then, hoofbeats, slow, careful. A single rider, her blood ran cold. She stepped to the stall door and peered through the slats. The man who dismounted was dressed in dark clothes, hat pulled low. When he looked up, she saw the pale scar across his cheek. Ambrose Ryder. Her throat tightened. She backed away silently, heart pounding so loud she feared he'd hear it. "Eleanor," his voice rolled through the barn like thunder. "Darling, come out. Let's stop this foolishness." She stayed hidden, pressing herself against the wooden beam. Every word he spoke dripped false tenderness. "You're sick, love. You don't know what you're doing. These people have filled your head with lies." Her hands shook, but something inside her had changed since the night she ran. Fear no longer ruled her. Anger did. She stepped out of the shadows. "You did this to me, Ambrose. You call it sickness because you can't call it guilt." His smile faltered. "You think anyone will believe you over me?" Before she could answer, a voice cut through the barn door like a whip. "I would." Ambrose turned. Wesley Colton stood framed in the doorway, rain running down the brim of his hat, shotgun leveled steady. The confrontation. "What business you got meddling in another man's marriage?" Ambrose sneered. "The kind that comes with a conscience," Wesley said. "You hiding my wife here is a crime." "No," Wesley replied. "Beating her was." For a heartbeat, the world held still. The three of them frozen in the breath before violence. Then Ambrose moved. His hand went for the revolver at his belt, but Wesley was faster. The blast from the shotgun shattered the silence, punching a hole through the barn wall inches from Ambrose's head. The horses screamed and reared. "Next one goes where I aim," Wesley warned. "Mount up and ride out." Ambrose's face twisted, part rage, part disbelief that anyone would dare defy him. But he saw the truth in Wesley's eyes. There was no bluff there, only resolve carved from years of loss. He backed away slowly. "You'll regret this, old man. You don't know who you're crossing." "I reckon I do," Wesley said. "A coward." Ambrose swung into his saddle and rode off into the rain. The thunder swallowed the sound of his retreat. Aftermath. Eleanor collapsed against the stall rail, trembling. Wesley set the gun aside and caught her by the shoulders. "You did right standing your ground," he said. "I thought he'd kill us both. He won't try that again. Not while I'm breathing." Tears welled in her eyes, not of fear but of release. For the first time, someone had faced her monster and not flinched. Later, as the storm eased, she sat by the fire wrapped in a blanket. Wesley poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. The silence between them was full, not empty, a shared understanding of what it meant to survive. He said quietly, "You remind me of my daughter." Eleanor looked up. Elizabeth, he nodded. She had your same stubborn eyes. Never backed down from what was right. She smiled softly. Maybe she sent me here. Wesley stared into the flames. Maybe she did. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper against the window panes. In the distance, thunder grumbled like a warning yet to come. Ambrose Ryder would not accept humiliation. His pride was a beast with a long memory, and though he had ridden away, his shadow would soon return, bringing with it a reckoning that neither of them could yet imagine. But for tonight, in the flicker of the fire, two wounded souls found something rare in that vast, unforgiving valley, peace enough to breathe. The next morning the storm had passed, but the world it left behind felt heavier, the sky pale and bruised. Every puddle reflected the mountains like an open wound, and the smell of wet earth clung to everything. Wesley Colton woke before dawn, listening to the drip of rain from the eaves and the faint sound of Eleanor moving in the kitchen. He found her there, sleeves rolled, hair still damp from washing, slicing bread with careful precision. The calm of her hands belied the restless look in her eyes. You didn't sleep, he said. Couldn't, she replied. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like his horse coming back. He won't be back today. She looked up. You can't know that? No, he admitted. But I can be ready if he is. He poured coffee and sat across from her. Between them, the steam curled upward like ghost breath. Wounds and plans. Wesley spent the morning in the workshop oiling his rifle and checking the hinges on the barn doors. He moved with slow, methodical care, the kind born from years of knowing that caution kept you alive. Eleanor joined him, carrying a tin of salve she'd made from sage and pine resin. She set it on the table beside him. For your hands, she said. You work too much. He smiled faintly. That's how I stay out of trouble. They didn't speak for a while. The rhythm of the brush on metal filled the silence. Finally, she said, I can't keep hiding forever, Wesley. Sooner or later, Ambrose will make the law his weapon. He nodded slowly. That's why we're not hiding. We're preparing. Preparing for what? For truth, he said simply. A visit to Echo Springs. By midday, he hitched the wagon again. We're going to town, he told her. You'll keep your head down and let me do the talking. Echo Springs was a scattering of clapboard buildings and wind-bent signs and a place that had once dreamed of being a city and settled instead for being a stop on the way to somewhere else. The general store smelled of tobacco, soap, and rain-damp wool. Wesley bought feed, lamp oil, and coffee before making one more stop, the sheriff's office. The man behind the desk was younger than Wesley remembered, a replacement. He looked up with polite suspicion. Colton, haven't seen you in town since before I took the badge. Been keeping busy. They exchanged small talk until Wesley said quietly, You know Ambrose Ryder's put half the county on alert for his wife. That bounty's drawing the wrong kind of folks. The sheriff shrugged. Man's got the law on his side. Says she's unstable. Unstable people don't cross mountain passes in the rain and build fences the next week, Wesley replied. The sheriff studied him. You found her then? Wesley's stare didn't waver. I found the truth, and it's uglier than anything she's done. A long pause. Then the sheriff sighed. Bring me proof, Colton. Without it, Ryder owns the story. Ghost of paper. That evening, back at the ranch, Eleanor spread her mother's letter on the table once more. The name Clara Ryder caught the lamplight. She turned the paper over and saw what she had missed before. Faint, water-damaged script on the reverse side, almost invisible. Wesley fetched his magnifying glass. Together they read, If this ever reaches you, Ellie, know that the Ryders cannot be trusted. They wear kindness like silk. They will use your name, your love, your very life to protect their own. Eleanor's breath shook. She knew, she whispered. She knew what they were. Wesley folded the paper carefully. Then we'll make sure everyone else knows too. The return, the next afternoon, a Ryder came again. Not Ambrose this time, but the deputy who'd visited before. He carried an envelope sealed with red wax. Mr. Colton, he said, uneasy. Sheriff's orders. Mrs. Ryder is to appear in town tomorrow. Her husband's filed an affidavit claiming she's unfit to manage her affairs. Wesley took the paper, jaw tightening. An insanity hearing, he muttered. He's moving faster than I thought. When the deputy rode off, Eleanor sank onto the porch step. He's going to win, isn't he? Men like him always do. Wesley crouched beside her. Only when decent people stay quiet. He looked out toward the darkening hills. We'll go. But on our terms. Night before the reckoning. That night the wind came down from the peaks cold and sharp. Inside the cabin the fire burned low, shadows moving like ghosts along the walls. Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat by the window watching lightning flash over the far ridges. Wesley joined her carrying 2 mugs of coffee. You ever been afraid? She asked. Every man who says he hasn't is lying, he said. Difference is, I stopped letting fear choose my road. She turned to him. I can't let him take me back there. He won't. The certainty in his voice steadied her more than any promise could. The hearing, the courthouse in Echo Springs smelled of dust and varnish. Ambrose Ryder stood near the judge's bench, all polished grief and practiced sorrow. When Eleanor entered, gasps rippled through the onlookers. Her face was bruised, but her spine straight. Ambrose spread his arms theatrically. My wife has been unwell. She imagines abuse where there was only love. Wesley's voice cut through. You call love the bruises on her ribs? The fever from nights locked outside in the cold? Murmurs filled the room. The judge rapped his gavel. Evidence, Mr. Colton. Eleanor stepped forward. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. I have a letter, she said. From my mother, Clara Ryder. The judge frowned. The Clara Ryder? She nodded and handed over the paper. The room went silent as he read. When he finished, his expression had changed from curiosity to alarm. This letter implicates the Ryder family in a decades-old inheritance fraud, he said slowly. Mrs. Ryder is the rightful heir to the Hayes estate, the fortune her husband currently controls. Ambrose's face drained of color. That's absurd. Enough, the judge barked. You'll surrender all holdings until investigation is complete. Aftermath outside, the sky broke open again, rain spilling down in silver sheets. Eleanor stood on the courthouse steps, shaking. Not from fear this time, but from release. Wesley placed his coat around her shoulders. It's over, she whispered. Not quite, he said. Justice isn't the same as peace, but it's a start. They walked back toward the wagon, boots splashing through puddles. Behind them, Ambrose shouted curses into the storm, a man watching his power dissolve. Eleanor turned once, just long enough to see him fade into the gray, then faced forward again. Each step away from that courthouse felt like reclaiming a heartbeat she'd thought was gone forever. The quiet promise. That night back at the ranch, the firelight was soft and gold. Wesley poured a final cup of coffee and sat beside her. You've got a future to build now, he said. Land, name, freedom, all yours. She looked at him, eyes bright. And you? He smiled faintly. I've got fences to mend and ghosts to bury. Eleanor reached across the table and laid her hand over his. You've already done both. Outside, the wind had gentled. The valley was quiet, washed clean again. Somewhere, faint and sweet, the music box began to play. The same lullaby her mother once hummed. This time it didn't sound like sorrow. It sounded like home. When the river rises. The rain that fell after the hearing didn't stop for 3 days. It wasn't the furious kind that ripped trees from their roots or washed roads away. It was the slow, relentless sort that seeped into everything. The valley filled with the scent of wet earth and pine. The river swelled to the brim, and the world took on the soft, gray quiet of things in recovery. Inside Wesley Colton's ranch house, that quiet stretched long and heavy. Eleanor spent hours staring out the window, watching the droplets race down the glass like memories she couldn't stop chasing. For the first time in weeks, she was safe, truly safe. And yet peace didn't come easily. Wesley could feel it too. The silence had weight. He moved through the house fixing small things, tightening a hinge, cleaning his rifle, splitting firewood. He'd been a man who'd lived on duty his whole life, and when duty finally ended, it left behind only the sound of rain on an old roof. The unspoken space between them on the 4th evening, Eleanor finally broke the silence. She stood by the hearth, the firelight catching the auburn strands in her hair, and said softly, Do you ever think about leaving this place? Wesley didn't look up from the rope he was coiling. Every day, he said. Then why don't you? He gave a short laugh. Where would I go? The world out there's already done with me. She moved closer. You don't really believe that. I do, he said, voice quiet. After you've buried enough, you stop looking forward. You just tend what's left. Eleanor's gaze softened. Maybe tending is all right as long as it's not just graves you're tending. That line hung between them, fragile as the smoke rising from the fire. For a long while, neither spoke. The clock ticked. The rain fell. Somewhere outside, a horse stamped and snorted, restless in its stall. The letter from the sheriff. By dawn, the storm broke. Wesley saddled up to check the fences when he found a rider approaching. The sheriff again, hat pulled low against the mist. He handed Wesley an envelope stamped with the county seal. "She's cleared," the sheriff said. "The court verified the signature on that letter. Ryder's been stripped of the estate, and there's talk he might leave Montana altogether." Wesley nodded slowly. "Good riddance," but the sheriff wasn't smiling. "He's gone missing. Left his holdings in ruin, took what cash he could. No trace of him since the storm." Wesley felt the words settle in his gut like cold iron. "Men like him don't disappear," he said. "They bide their time." The sheriff met his eyes. "That's what I'm afraid of." Seeds of doubt. That night, Wesley didn't sleep much. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move when he looked away. He checked the barn twice, lit the lanterns along the porch, and still the uneasy feeling wouldn't lift. Eleanor noticed it too. "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked quietly as they stood on the porch. The moon was a faint cloud-veiled smudge overhead. "I think a man who's lost everything either drinks himself numb or tries to take something from someone else. Maybe he's gone for good." Wesley exhaled slowly. "Maybe, but until I'm sure you stay close." Her eyes flickered, a flash of fear and defiance. "I won't live scared, Wesley. Not again." "You don't have to," he said, turning toward her. "But you'll live smart." There was steel in his voice, but behind it, a kind of trembling care she'd learned to recognize, the sound of a man who'd already lost too much to risk another loss. The flood, 2 nights later, the river rose. The valley had taken all the rain it could bear, and now the banks were breaking. Water poured down from the mountain gullies, brown and wild, dragging branches, debris, and memory with it. Eleanor woke to the sound of roaring. Not thunder this time, but the river itself. "Wesley," she shouted, running barefoot down the hall. He was already pulling on his boots. "Barn's flooding," he said. "If we don't move the horses now, we'll lose them." They fought the storm together. Mud sucked at their feet. Rain blinded them. Wesley waded waist-deep into the corral, cutting loose the panicked horses one by one, while Eleanor held the lantern high despite the wind threatening to snuff it out. At one point, lightning flashed, illuminating the valley in stark white. In that brief, terrible light, just for a heartbeat, she thought she saw a silhouette on the far ridge. A lone rider, still as stone, watching. "Wesley," she gasped. He turned, but by the time he looked, the ridge was empty again. When the water finally began to recede near dawn, they were soaked, exhausted, and shivering. Wesley led the last horse into the dry pen and slumped against the gate, chest heaving. "You all right?" Eleanor asked, kneeling beside him. He nodded, though his hands trembled. "You did good." "So did you," she said, managing a smile through the mud streaking her face. "Guess we make a good team." He looked at her, really looked, and something unspoken passed between them, a quiet recognition that survival wasn't just luck. It was choice and trust. The hidden pain back inside, as the sun began to break through the clouds, Eleanor fetched a towel and knelt by Wesley's side to clean the scrape on his shoulder. He winced. "Rub it gently," she said with a teasing smile. He huffed a breath that was almost laughter. "That's easy for you to say." But as her hand moved, steady, careful, warm, something inside him cracked open. Beneath the grime and exhaustion, she could see it. Not just the physical pain, but the years of guilt and loneliness he carried like armor. "Wesley," she said softly. "You can stop fighting now." He froze. His breath hitched. "I'm not." "Yes, you are," she whispered. "You fight everything, the world, the past, yourself. You keep everyone at arm's length so you don't have to lose them again." Her words landed like truth rarely does. Quietly, but with the power to break walls. He stared into the fire for a long time, then said hoarsely, "You remind me of her." "My daughter Elizabeth." Eleanor's eyes softened. "You told me once she was gone." "She was, still is. But somehow when you came here I started hearing her laughter again. Started remembering what it felt like to care without being afraid." She pressed the cloth to his shoulder one last time, then met his gaze. I'm not her, Wesley, she said gently. But maybe I can help you remember her without pain. He nodded, a single small motion, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was almost a whisper. Then maybe you're the reason I survived long enough to remember anything at all. The calm after-by morning, the rain had stopped for good. The valley glittered with dew and the river ran wide but peaceful again. The world smelled of renewal, raw and clean. Eleanor stood at the fence line watching the horses graze. Wesley joined her, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. You ever think, she said quietly, that some storms come just to wash the old things away? He smiled faintly. And leave the land ready for something new. She took the mug from his hand and looked toward the horizon, where the sun was climbing over the mountains.
Do you think he's gone?
Ryder? Wesley shook his head slowly. Men like him don't disappear, but maybe the world's finally done giving him places to hide. Eleanor turned to him, her face calm for the first time in a long while, then let him run. I'm done living afraid. He studied her, the strength in her posture, the light returning to her eyes. And for the first time in years, he felt something like hope. Closing scene that night. They ate by the fire again, quiet but content. The music box sat open on the table, the melody spinning softly through the room. Wesley reached for it, turning the small silver lid with rough fingers. It's a strange thing, he said. You find pain where you least expect it, and sometimes you find healing in the same place. Eleanor smiled faintly. Maybe that's what life is, learning to rub the hurt gently until it turns into something else. Wesley looked at her then, really looked, and this time, he didn't see a frightened girl or a reminder of loss. He saw a survivor, a woman who'd walked through fire and rain and somehow still believed in the sun. Maybe you're right, he said. Maybe that's what it means to start over. Outside, the frogs had begun their night song, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled faintly, and not a storm this time, just the echo of one that had already passed. The weight of kindness. Morning came with a stillness so complete it almost felt rehearsed, the kind of silence the land holds after a storm, when even the birds seem hesitant to break it. The ranch lay washed clean under a gold autumn sun, the air carrying the faint scent of sage and wet pine. Eleanor stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, watching the fog lift off the meadow. She could see Wesley out near the pasture, mending a broken section of fence. His movements were slower now, careful, not from weakness but from thoughtfulness. Every nail, every knot in the rope seemed to mean something again. It had been a week since the flood. A week since the valley had been tested, and somehow both she and the ranch had survived. A letter returned. The mail came by noon as it always did. A single envelope this time, mud-smeared and worn at the edges. Wesley set it on the table without a word. Eleanor noticed the handwriting before she even touched it. Ryder Ambrose. Her heart tightened. You opened it? No. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. But I figured you might need to. She hesitated, then tore it open. Inside was a single page, the writing uneven and raw. Eleanor, they took everything. I could blame you, but I won't. The truth is, I destroyed myself long before you ever stood up to me. You were right to fight. I hope you found peace in that valley. The same peace I never could. Eleanor read it twice before she realized her hands were shaking. She sank into the chair and stared at the paper as if it might change if she looked long enough. Wesley watched her quietly. He's gone? She nodded. I think so. He frowned. Think? There's a postmark from 2 towns over, dated before the flood. If he made it that far, maybe he just kept going. Wesley looked out the window, his jaw set. Men like that don't change overnight. No, she agreed softly. But maybe they can stop running. She folded the letter and placed it in the fire. The paper curled, blackened, and was gone. She didn't need proof of his regret. What she needed was to live without its shadow. The return to work. The days began to fill again, feeding horses, repairing the barn, tending to the land that had nearly been swallowed by the river. Eleanor threw herself into it. Her hands toughened, her shoulders grew strong, and her laughter, quiet at first, started to drift through the valley like wind chimes in a forgotten garden. Wesley would sometimes pause in his work to watch her. The girl who'd arrived frightened and bruised now moved with confidence, unafraid of the land or the sky above it. One evening he said, "You ever think about making this place yours?" She blinked. "Mine?" He nodded. "I'm not much for legacy anymore, but someone ought to keep this place alive. Someone who sees more than fences and feed." Eleanor smiled faintly. "You're not planning on leaving me all this, are you?" "Not yet," he said with a grin. "But someday, yeah. Someone's got to keep it honest." She looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "I'd take care of it. Not because I owe you, but because this land, it's where I learned to breathe again." The festival by the end of the month, the valley gathered for the autumn harvest festival, the first in years. The townsfolk came down the road with pies, jars of preserves, and the kind of laughter that only happens when people start to forgive the past. Wesley and Eleanor arrived together, their wagon filled with baskets of apples from the small grove behind the barn. For many who had once turned away from her, Eleanor's presence was a quiet reckoning, proof that grace can grow in even the harshest soil. The sheriff raised a glass. "To storm survived," he said, "and to those who keep the land standing." As the music started, fiddles, drums, and laughter, Eleanor caught Wesley watching her again. He gave her a nod, the kind that said, "You're home now." For the first time, she believed it. The night confession. The festival ran late into the night. By the time they reached the ranch, the stars had scattered across the sky like spilled sugar. The air was cold and clean. They sat by the fire, sipping coffee, wrapped in the kind of tiredness that feels earned. Wesley broke the silence first. "You know," he said slowly, "there was a time I thought the only thing I was good at was holding on to what hurt." Eleanor glanced up at him. "And now?" "Now I'm starting to see the difference between pain that teaches and pain that just stays because you let it." She smiled, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "That's the hard part, learning when to let go." He nodded. "You taught me that." They sat there for a while longer, the only sound the soft pop of the firewood. Then, almost as if to himself, Wesley said, "You remember what you told me that night and after the flood?" "About what?" "Rub it gently," he said with a quiet chuckle. "Never thought a line like that would change how I see the world." She laughed softly. "Guess it wasn't just about wounds." "No," he said, looking into the flames. "It was about living." The farewell ride spring came early that year. The river ran clear again. The fields burst green with new life. One morning Wesley saddled up 2 horses. "Come on," he called. "You've seen this valley from the ground. Now it's time you see it from the ridge." They rode in silence for a while, the sound of hooves steady and sure. When they reached the top, the view spread wide. Rolling fields, sunlight spilling over the mountains, and the faint trace of the river that had once tried to claim them. Eleanor dismounted, eyes wide. "It's beautiful." "It's yours," Wesley said simply. She turned, startled. "What do you mean?" He handed her a folded deed. "Made it official. The ranch, the land, everything. I've had my years here. It's time someone new carried it forward." Tears welled in her eyes. "Wesley, I can't." "You can," he said gently. "Because you already have. You brought life back to this place. I just kept the fire burning long enough for you to find it." Eleanor reached for him, and for a long moment they simply stood there. Not as savior and saved, not as the past and the present, but as 2 souls who had rebuilt something sacred out of loss. The final scene weeks later, when the first wildflowers appeared, a stranger rode through town carrying news. Ryder Ambrose had been found in a mining town across the border, alive, sober, working under a false name. Eleanor listened quietly, then thanked the rider and went out to the porch. She stood there looking toward the mountains where the wind moved like breath through the pines. Wesley joined her. "You okay?" She nodded. "He's not my ghost anymore." He smiled. "Then it's done." She looked at him, eyes bright with something softer than triumph, maybe peace. "No, Wesley. It's just beginning." The sun dipped low, turning the sky to amber. Wesley went back inside to stir the stew, and Eleanor walked down to the riverbank. The water ran clear now, reflecting the last light of day. She knelt, dipped her hands into the cool current, and whispered, not to the past, not to the pain, but to herself, "Rub it gently." And let it heal. The wind carried the words downstream, and somewhere far beyond the bend, the world felt lighter for having heard them. The end.